What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? The question wasn't one Alara ever spoke aloud. It was just there, waiting for her in the quiet of the old stable every morning. It was in the frost that crackled under her boots, a sharp, brittle sound in the pre-dawn dark. It was in the smell of old hay and clean, cold air, a scent that still carried, if she breathed deep enough, the faintest ghost of his pipe tobacco. And it was in the wind, a low, lonely moan as it swept across the Montana plains and slipped through the cracks in the timber, whispering through a stable that felt too big, too empty, for just one horse. Winter had come early and with a vicious intent, settling over the land like a grudge. The world outside was a study in monochrome, all white fields and gray sky, the rising sun a pale, diluted smear behind the clouds. Alara's breath plumed in the air as she moved down the aisle, her footsteps the only sound. She avoided looking into the empty stalls, their doors yawning open onto shadows. Her entire world had shrunk to this chore, this duty, this penance. Her father had loved this place, every splintered post, every worn leather strap. He'd loved the rhythm of it, the simple, honest work of caring for something so much larger than yourself. Now it was hers, and all that was left of him was the silence and the giant at the end of the row. He was in the last stall, the largest one. She felt him before she saw him, a shift in the atmosphere, a deep, warm presence in the cold. His name was Atlas. Her father had named him, said a horse that size needed a name that meant he could carry the weight of the world. He was a Shire, a stallion of such immense stature, he seemed less a living thing and more a monument carved from midnight. His coat was a deep, fathomless black, his legs feathered with hair like tangled silk. He stood perfectly still, watching her approach, his breath making soft clouds in the air of his stall. He had her father's eyes. That was the first thing she'd noticed, and the thing she could never forget. Not the color, but the depth. A deep, liquid brown that held a quiet, unnerving intelligence. Her father's eyes had always seemed to know exactly what she was thinking. Atlas's felt the same. They saw the grief she carried like a stone in her chest, the hollowed-out feeling that made every movement an effort. He saw it, and he seemed to understand it in a way no person could. The first week, he'd wanted nothing to do with her. He'd turn his immense back to her when she entered, a wall of muscle and indifference. She'd been relieved. His sorrow was a mirror of her own, and she couldn't bear to look into it. She'd just slide his hay over the door, fill his water, and leave, the silence feeling heavier each time. But routines have a way of wearing down even the hardest edges. Her presence became a constant, if not a welcome one. She started talking to him, not about anything important. Just the weather, the price of feed, the way the icicles hung from the eaves. She'd tell him about the book she was reading, her voice a low murmur against the howl of the wind outside. It was easier to talk to a horse than to people. People expected you to be okay. They offered platitudes that felt like thin, worn blankets against a blizzard. Atlas offered only his silence, and that was a gift. This morning, she forked fresh hay into his rack. He didn't turn away. He stood his ground, his great head lowered slightly, his ears swiveling toward the sound of her voice. She leaned against the stall door, the wood cold even through her thick jacket. She was so tired. The kind of tired that sleep couldn't fix. "Another cold one, big guy," she whispered, her voice rough with disuse. "Supposed to get worse. A real storm coming." He took a single step forward. Just one. The movement was so deliberate, so slow, it was like watching a mountain decide to move. He lowered his head further, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air between them. He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the honest scent of horse and hay. Her heart thumped a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She held her breath. He stretched his neck, his nose a soft, velvety promise in the frozen air. He didn't touch her. He just hovered, inhaling her scent, reading her story in the air. She exhaled. His whiskers brushed the rough sleeve of her coat, a sensation so faint she might have imagined it. Then he let out a long, deep sigh. A puff of warm, grassy air washed over her frozen hands. It wasn't an affection. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition, a pressure built behind her eyes, hot and sudden. She blinked it back, swallowing hard against the knot in her throat. She didn't move. She just stood there, in the shared space of his breath, in the fragile truce of the morning. When she finally turned to leave, her boots scuffing on the concrete, she heard the soft shuffle of straw behind her. She didn't need to look back. She could feel him there at the door, his dark head watching her go. And she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and comforting, that if she stopped, he would be waiting. That in all the vast, empty silence he had left behind, her father had not left her alone. He had left her a witness, a keeper of his silence, a giant, breathing monument to a love that was still, somehow, standing. The silence between them became a new language. Alara learned its grammar in the weeks that followed. The flick of Atlas's ear toward the house wasn't just a sound, it was a question about when she might return. The soft, low nicker he'd emit when she appeared in the doorway wasn't just a greeting. It was a recognition of their shared, solitary orbit. She stopped telling him about the weather and the books. She started telling him about her father. The stories were clumsy at first, rusted shut from disuse. She told him about the time her father tried to bake her a birthday cake and used salt instead of sugar, about the way he'd whistle an old Irish tune while mending fences, always just a little off-key. Atlas listened. He would stand with his great head hanging over the stall door, his eyes half closed, his breathing a steady metronome rhythm in the crisp air. Sometimes when she spoke of something particularly fond or foolish, he'd blow a soft rumbling breath through his lips, a sound that felt like equine laughter. It was during one of these stories, as she recounted her father's legendary hatred for the neighbor's yappy terrier, that she absently reached up and scratched the base of his forelock. Right in that spot, horses can never reach themselves. He went perfectly still. Not the stiff, wary stillness of before, but a deep, profound freeze. She froze too, her fingers lingering in the thick hair, worried she'd crossed some invisible line. Then a tremor went through him. A great shuddering sigh seemed to travel from the tips of his hooves all the way up to the crest of his neck. He leaned into her touch, ever so slightly, his massive head becoming heavy in her hand. His eyes slid completely shut. It was the first time he had accepted her touch, truly accepted it. Not tolerated it, but sought it. A thread, fine as spider silk but strong as steel, pulled taut between them. But with the connection came a strangeness, a subtle shift in the lexicon of their silence. He began to react to things that weren't there. One evening, as a particularly fierce gust of wind rattled the stable door on its track, a sound that usually just made his ears twitch, Atlas suddenly lifted his head and let out a sharp, high-pitched whinny. It wasn't a sound of alarm. It was a call. A searching, expectant call that echoed in the empty aisle and died away, leaving a deeper silence in its wake. He stood for a long time afterward, ears pricked toward the door, as if waiting for an answer that would never come. Another time she was mucking out the stall beside his, her father's old leather work gloves on her hands. As she passed by his door, Atlas stretched out his neck, his nostrils flaring wildly. He nudged her arm, not with gentleness, but with a sudden, urgent insistence. He sniffed the gloves, then her sleeve, then the gloves again, a low, confused rumble in his chest. He was looking for something. Someone. The scent on the leather was a ghost he recognized, a ghost he was still waiting for. Alara felt a resistance rise up in her, a cold, protective shell. She understood his grief was a mirror, but she couldn't bear to see her own reflection so clearly, to have this immense creature reflect back a loss so profound it defied words. She started spending less time in the stable, retreating to the hollow quiet of the house. She told herself it was the cold, the shortening days. But the truth was, Atlas's unwavering loyalty to a ghost felt like a condemnation of her own struggle to move on. His quiet, patient waiting made her own anger and sadness feel loud and messy and wrong. The breaking point came on the eve of the predicted storm. The air had grown heavy and still, the kind of silence that presses on the eardrums. The sky was a lid of bruised purple gray. She went out for one last check, her steps hurried, wanting only to finish the chore and retreat behind walls. She filled his water bucket to the brim. She gave him an extra flake of hay. As she turned to leave, he called out to her, a soft, questioning nicker. She ignored it, her hand on the latch of the main door. A sharp, splintering crack echoed from the hayloft above, just an old beam contracting in the cold. But the sound was a trigger. In an instant, Atlas was no longer a quiet giant in his stall. He was a whirlwind of pent-up energy and ancient instinct. He spun in the confined space, his hooves striking the wooden wall with a thunderous boom that shook the entire stable. He called out again, not a question this time, but a demand. A frantic, terrified call into the growing storm. It was the sound of absolute aloneness. It was the sound that had been trapped in her own chest for months. The dam inside her broke. She didn't think. She unlatched his stall door and stepped inside. The space, which had always felt large, suddenly felt impossibly small, filled with 1,000 pounds of frightened muscle. She stood in the corner, not trying to calm him, not speaking. She just wrapped her arms around herself and let the tears come. They weren't quiet tears. They were great, heaving sobs that she had been swallowing down for a year. She cried for her father. She cried for the empty house. She cried for the terrifying, vast emptiness of a future without its anchor. She slid down the wall onto the straw, her face in her hands, utterly lost to the storm inside her. She didn't know how long she sat there. But gradually, through the roar of her own grief, she became aware of a change. The frantic pounding had stopped. The air was still. She felt a warmth beside her. She looked up, her vision blurred. Atlas stood over her. He had quieted. His great head was lowered, his nostrils level with her own. His breath, warm and steady, washed over her face. He was simply breathing, in and out, a deep, rhythmic anchor in her chaos. He didn't nuzzle her. He didn't try to interrupt. He just stood there, his massive body a shelter from the wind that was now beginning to scream outside, his unwavering presence a silent testament to a simple truth. He was still here. She was still here, and that, for now, was enough. He stayed with her until her breathing slowed to match his, until the storm within her had passed. When she finally rose, her legs shaky, he took a single step back to give her room. There were no more ghosts between them. There was only the two of them, in the here and now. Weeks later, long after the great blizzard had buried the world in a deep, clean white and then receded, the transformation was quiet but absolute. The stable no longer felt like a museum of loss. It felt like a shelter. Ilara's movements were no longer heavy with duty, but filled with a quiet purpose. Atlas was quieter too, his head often resting over his stall door, not searching for anything, just watching for her. On a bright, cold morning, the sun glaring off the snow, she was brushing him. The curry comb moved in circles over his broad back, lifting winter dust. As she worked her way down his shoulder, her fingers brushed against something beneath the thick hair of his crest. Not a burr or a mat, something smooth and hard. She pushed the hair aside. There, braided permanently into the very foundation of his mane, was a simple leather tag. It was worn smooth and dark with age and weather, but the carving was still deep and clear. It wasn't his name. It was a date, the year, the month, the day, her father's birthday. It wasn't a brand. It wasn't an identification. It was a secret, a quiet, steadfast promise made between an old man and his friend. A reminder that every day was a gift, a day to be here, a day to carry on. Her fingers closed around the small tag. She didn't cry. She simply leaned her forehead against his solid shoulder, the sun warm on her back. He had been carrying it all this time, not as a burden, but as a truth. Sometimes, the ones who carry you through the blizzard are the ones who were sent ahead long before you ever knew you'd need them. And sometimes healing isn't about moving on. It's about learning who was left behind to walk beside you. If this story found a place in your heart, If you felt the warmth in that stable against the cold, then you know why we tell them. These are the threads that connect us. Please take a second to subscribe and hit that bell. It means you'll be here for the next story, the next moment of quiet truth, waiting for you just when you need it most. Leave a comment below, tell us what you felt, and thank you for listening.